In the heart of West Africa, a nation blessed with abundant natural resources found itself at a crossroads. Nigeria discovered a treasure beneath its soil oil. This discovery, a beacon of hope, would soon become a double-edged sword. The year was 1956, and the promise of black gold ignited dreams of a brighter future. The discovery of oil in Oloibiri marked a turning point in Nigeria's history. It held the potential to elevate the nation to economic powerhouse status. However, the story of NNPC is not one of unbridled success and shared prosperity. Instead, it's a tale of missed opportunities, deeply entrenched corruption, and a pervasive lack of accountability. The creation of NNPC was met with optimism, a symbol of Nigeria's ambition to control its destiny and harness its resources for the betterment of its people. The corporation was granted sweeping powers, controlling every aspect of the oil and gas industry, from exploration to distribution. This immense power, however, would prove to be a double-edged sword. As oil revenues began to flow into the nation's coffers, so too did the seeds of corruption take root. The very institution entrusted with safeguarding Nigeria's oil wealth became the primary instrument of its plunder. The lines between the state and the corporation blurred, creating a breeding ground for cronyism, patronage, and outright theft. NNPC's opaque operations and lack of transparency became the perfect cover for a systematic siphoning of funds. Billions of dollars, earmarked for infrastructure development, education, and healthcare, vanished into a labyrinth of shell corporations, offshore accounts, and the pockets of corrupt officials. The Nigerian people, who were promised prosperity, instead inherited a legacy of poverty, environmental degradation, and social unrest. The Niger Delta, the heart of Nigeria's oil production, became a stark symbol of this broken promise. Once a vibrant ecosystem teeming with life, the region transformed into a polluted wasteland, its people impoverished and marginalized. The very source of Nigeria's wealth became a curse for those who lived in its shadow. The unchecked power of NNPC, coupled with a culture of impunity, created a fertile ground for corruption to flourish. Government officials entrusted with overseeing the corporation instead became complicit in its plunder. A complex web of patronage and kickbacks emerged, ensnaring politicians, bureaucrats, and business elites in a cycle of greed. The lack of accountability within NNPC was staggering. Financial records were shrouded in secrecy, audits were routinely ignored, and those who dared to question the corporation's practices were silenced or intimidated. The Nigerian people, the rightful owners of the nation's oil wealth, were kept in the dark, their voices drowned out by the deafening silence of complicity. As corruption within NNPC deepened, so too did the divide between the ruling elite and the impoverished masses. The gap between the haves and the have-nots widened, fueling social unrest and instability. The Niger Delta, in particular, became a hotbed of militancy and violence as communities, pushed to the brink, took up arms to demand a share of the oil wealth being extracted from their land. The seeds of discord sown by NNPC's corruption continue to plague Nigeria to this day. The story of NNPC is a cautionary tale of how unchecked power, greed, and a lack of accountability can transform a beacon of hope into a symbol of national despair. The 1970s witnessed an unprecedented surge in global oil prices, catapulting Nigeria into an era of unforeseen wealth. The discovery of vast oil reserves in the Niger Delta transformed the nation into a major oil exporter, its coffers overflowing with petrodollars. This economic windfall, however, would prove to be a double-edged sword, setting the stage for a culture of corruption that would permeate every level of Nigerian society. The oil boom brought with it a sense of euphoria and boundless possibilities. The government embarked on ambitious infrastructure projects, eager to showcase Nigeria's newfound economic might. Skyscrapers rose from the ground, new highways crisscrossed the nation, and universities expanded to accommodate a growing student population. The future seemed bright, fueled by the seemingly endless stream of oil revenue. However, beneath the veneer of progress and prosperity, a darker reality was taking shape. The sudden influx of wealth had a corrosive effect on Nigeria's political and social fabric. Corruption, once a problem confined to the shadows, became rampant, infecting every branch of government and the burgeoning oil industry. Section 2. A culture of impunity takes root. As oil money flooded into government coffers, so too did greed, and a sense of entitlement take hold among those in power. NNPC, the gatekeeper of Nigeria's oil wealth, became a symbol of this culture of impunity. The corporation's operations, shrouded in secrecy, provided ample opportunities for embezzlement, bribery, and other forms of financial malfeasance. Politicians and high-ranking officials treated NNPC as their personal fiefdom, awarding lucrative contracts to cronies and family members in exchange for kickbacks and political support. Public funds, meant to uplift the lives of ordinary Nigerians, were siphoned off into private bank accounts, often stashed away in offshore havens beyond the reach of the law. The judiciary, tasked with upholding the rule of law, proved ineffective in curbing the tide of corruption. Judges were susceptible to bribes and political pressure, allowing corrupt officials to escape justice and continue their plunder with impunity. The few individuals who dared to speak out against the rampant graft were often silenced, intimidated, or simply disappeared. Section 3. The price of neglect. While a select few amassed unimaginable wealth, the majority of Nigerians continued to languish in poverty. The oil boom failed to translate into widespread prosperity, as the nation's newfound riches were squandered through corruption and mismanagement. Infrastructure, once a source of national pride, began to crumble due to neglect and a lack of maintenance. The education and healthcare systems, starved of funding, deteriorated, leaving millions of Nigerians without access to basic services. The gap between the rich and the poor widened into a chasm, fueling social unrest and resentment. The Niger Delta, the heart of Nigeria's oil production, bore the brunt of this neglect. Despite being the source of the nation's wealth, the region remained underdeveloped and impoverished. Oil spills, gas flaring, and other environmental hazards, a direct result of the oil industry's reckless pursuit of profit, devastated the local ecosystem, destroying livelihoods and poisoning communities. Section 4. A legacy of distrust and discontent. The oil boom of the 1970s left an indelible mark on Nigeria. Instead of ushering in an era of prosperity and progress, it sowed the seeds of corruption, inequality, and social unrest. NNPC, once a symbol of national aspiration, became synonymous with greed, mismanagement, and a betrayal of public trust. The corporation's legacy continues to haunt Nigeria to this day. The culture of impunity that took root during the oil boom persists, hindering efforts to combat corruption and promote good governance. The Niger Delta remains a region plagued by poverty, violence, and environmental degradation, a stark reminder of the human cost of unchecked greed and the failure to translate oil wealth into national development.
The puppet masters, high-ranking officials, and NNPC executives.
Powerful individuals exploited their positions for personal gain, treating NNPC as their personal piggy bank. Their greed left a devastating legacy on Nigeria's development.
Diazani Alison Madueka, former Minister of Petroleum Resources, was a key figure in this corruption. She presided over rampant corruption and financial mismanagement.
Andrew Yakubu, former NNPC Group Managing Director, amassed a fortune far exceeding his legitimate earnings. Their actions fueled a culture of impunity that continues to plague Nigeria's oil sector.
The facilitators, private companies and the art of the deal. Private companies enabled the siphoning of public funds through shady deals and opaque transactions.
These companies, often owned by politically connected individuals, profited handsomely from the NNPC scandal.
Zenon Petroleum, owned by Femi Otedola, was awarded lucrative fuel import contracts.
Investigations revealed billions in subsidies for undelivered fuel, highlighting systemic fraud.
Atlantic Energy, linked to G. de Omokori, was awarded oil blocks without due process. The company's operations were shrouded in secrecy, raising suspicions of kickbacks. These actions highlight the systemic nature of corruption in Nigeria.
The global network, international entities, and the shadowy world of oil trading.
The NNPC corruption scandal extends beyond Nigeria, involving international entities and oil trading giants. These global players exploited Nigeria's weak regulatory framework to secure lucrative contracts. Their involvement highlights the transnational nature of corruption.
One such entity is Trafigura, implicated in bribing Nigerian officials for fuel contracts.
Trafigura reportedly paid millions in bribes, fueling NNPC corruption. This underscores the need for greater scrutiny of the global oil trade. The true cost of corruption extends far beyond financial losses. It erodes public trust and perpetuates poverty. NNPC's financial violations paint a grim picture of graft and mismanagement. Billions in lost revenue and stolen funds tell a story of betrayal. The Farouk Lawan Committee revealed $6.8 billion lost to corruption in the fuel subsidy program. 90 audits show discrepancies in oil revenue, highlighting NNPC's lack of transparency. These figures likely represent only a fraction of the true cost of corruption within NNPC. The Farouk Lawan Committee report, released in 2012, exposed systemic corruption within NNPC. It detailed fraudulent practices and financial violations costing Nigeria billions.
The findings sparked public outrage and calls for accountability. Key revelations included fraud within the fuel subsidy program. Billions were paid for fuel never delivered, with fraudulent claims for non-existent imports.
The corruption that plagued NNPC for decades has had a devastating impact on Nigeria's economy. It perpetuates a cycle of poverty and inequality. Billions lost to corruption could have been invested in education, healthcare, and infrastructure. Instead, funds were siphoned off, leaving economic stagnation and social unrest. Limited access to quality education leaves millions of young Nigerians unprepared for the global economy. The healthcare system, starved of funding, struggles to provide basic services. Corruption discourages foreign investment, hampering economic growth and job creation. The Niger Delta, despite its oil wealth, remains underdeveloped and impoverished. As the stench of corruption within NNPC became increasingly overpowering, suffocating the hopes and aspirations of ordinary Nigerians, a groundswell of public anger began to rise.
The year was 2012, and the Nigerian House of Representatives, feeling the pulse of the nation, took a bold step towards accountability.
They established a special ad hoc committee, led by the astute and determined Farouk Lawan, to investigate the deeply entrenched rot within the fuel subsidy regime, a system designed to ease the burden on citizens but instead hijacked by greed.
This committee, armed with the power to subpoena witnesses, scrutinize financial records, and expose the truth, embarked on a mission to unravel the intricate web of corruption that had ensnared NNPC.
Their mandate was clear: to determine the extent of the financial violations within the fuel subsidy program, identify those responsible, and recommend measures to prevent such egregious abuses in the future.
The nation, weary of empty promises and yearning for justice, looked on with a mix of hope and skepticism.
The Farouk Lawan Committee, acutely aware of the weight of expectations upon their shoulders, approached their task with unwavering determination.
It was about restoring faith in a system that had long been rigged against the interests of ordinary Nigerians. They understood that their investigation was not merely about uncovering financial impropriety.
Their work would be a test of the nation's commitment to transparency, accountability, and the rule of law. The Farouk Lawan Committee, after months of investigation, delivered its report to the Nigerian House of Representatives.
The findings exposed a level of corruption that surpassed even the most cynical expectations.
The fuel subsidy program had been transformed into a feeding trough for corrupt officials and their cronies.
Companies colluded with corrupt NNPC officials to receive billions in subsidies for non-existent fuel.
The financial hemorrhage was staggering, with $6.8 billion siphoned off.
The report implicated several high-profile individuals and companies in the scandal.
Prominent businessmen, senior NNPC officials, and banks were named in the report. The Farouk Lawan Committee exposed the rot within the fuel subsidy program.
It offered a roadmap for reform, outlining steps to dismantle corruption structures.
These recommendations aimed to restore accountability and public trust.
Central was a complete overhaul of NNPC.
The committee urged criminal charges against those implicated.
Holding perpetrators accountable could restore public trust.
The Great Fuel Subsidy Heist, a nation bled dry. The fuel subsidy program, meant to shield Nigerians from global oil price volatility, became a grand heist, siphoning billions from public coffers. NNPC, shrouded in secrecy, driven by greed, bled the nation dry. They inflated fuel imports, claiming subsidies for phantom shipments. The scale of the fraud was staggering. The Farouk Lawan Committee estimated $6.8 billion was siphoned off between 2009 and 2011. This money, meant for ordinary Nigerians, lined the pockets of a corrupt few. The scam stole not just money, but the nation's future. Section 2, Smoke and Mirrors, the Illusion of Affordability. The fuel subsidy program, despite its noble intentions, created a perverse system of incentives, distorting the market and enriching a select few. The artificially low fuel prices masked the true cost, creating a mirage of affordability. Subsidized prices fueled waste and inefficiency. Consumers had little incentive to conserve fuel, leading to overconsumption and increased demand for imports. This enriched corrupt importers, perpetuating the cycle of corruption. Subsidized prices created a thriving black market, enriching smugglers and criminal networks. The ripple effects of subsidy abuse. The abuse of the fuel subsidy program had far-reaching consequences, undermining Nigeria's economic stability and eroding public trust. The scandal exposed the fragility of the nation's institutions and the depth of corruption. Billions siphoned off deprived critical sectors like education, healthcare, and infrastructure. This underinvestment trapped millions in poverty. The scandal eroded public trust, fueling cynicism and apathy. It also exacerbated regional inequalities, leaving the Niger Delta in poverty despite its wealth. The enablers from abroad. The NNPC corruption scandal was facilitated by foreign entities, including multinational corporations and shadowy intermediaries. These actors, driven by greed, perpetuated a system siphoning billions from Nigeria.
Trafigura, a Swiss-based trading giant, allegedly engaged in bribery, funneling millions to Nigerian officials.
Glencore also faced allegations of questionable practices to secure oil access. These corporations exploit weak regulatory frameworks, making accountability difficult. The price of complicity, international actors, and the erosion of accountability. Foreign entities in the NNPC scandal erode accountability and weaken Nigeria's institutions. They contribute to a culture of impunity, normalizing corruption.
Foreign companies engaging in bribery create incentives for larger kickbacks. This entrenches corruption as a part of the system.
Foreign involvement undermines local anti-corruption efforts. These companies can silence critics and stymie investigations. The NNPC scandal shows the need for a global effort against corruption. Holding foreign companies accountable is crucial for good governance. The enduring legacy of NNPC's greed. The saga of corruption surrounding NNPC is a stark indictment of a system that has failed its people. Greed and impunity have triumphed over accountability and the public good.
The billions siphoned off, the broken promises, and the shattered dreams of ordinary Nigerians paint a grim picture. A nation held captive by a culture of corruption. The consequences are all too real. Schools lie in ruins, hospitals lack supplies, and roads remain unpaved, while those entrusted with the nation's wealth flaunt their ill-gotten gains. The Niger Delta stands as a tragic testament to the devastating impact of this corruption. Its once pristine environment ravaged by oil spills and gas flaring, its people mired in poverty and despair.
The fight against corruption is about reclaiming a nation's soul and restoring faith in institutions. Building a future where the rule of law prevails over the rule of greed. Ensuring Nigeria's vast oil wealth becomes a blessing, a catalyst for sustainable development, a brighter future for all Nigerians.